So I will be the first person to respond to these presentations on the book. But as to continue Sophia's some of the concerns, today morning I was also delighted to see so many students coming up with quite clear articulation of what they have read in textbooks. So I think you have read textbook better than many other students in other schools. And it's really appreciable because this is a stage where you are putting your knowledge at stake and you have come out, and it's our duty to address that. So in the pretext of this session, I try to address that. The first thing is that we have a common sense which is generated by textbook readings, which is actually an experiential entity for the Westerners. I don't know whether we understand it or not. Simply because I tell you, many of you talk that it's your experience. No, we did not ask what is your personal experience, but you would have cited some of these things. But here we are confusing with two things. One, the phenomenon or the happenings in or the practices in the society. Second thing, the way we interpret them or the way we understand them. There is a lot of gap. When you are talking about caste system, you are, unless and until you are not talking about a legal system, you cannot talk about caste system. So law is something actually very, very crucial. But I don't know whether Indians understand what law means, because this legal system is a system which was introduced to India after the colonial period. And it is the experience of those people who thought that there is a set of laws which governs some system here. That's why Manusmriti becomes very important. Otherwise, no one cares for that. But the problem with Manusmriti is that if some lines support your argument, some other lines contradict it. In case of women, yatra naryastu pujyante, then again you say that nastri swatantra marhat. Yeah. So then it must be something else. If one bases Manusmriti to find or form a Hindu law, then he will become mad, because which line he has to pick up. So what you are referring to is practice. See, what you are talking that experience, I think you are referring to practice only. I don't think you experience that law, because see, there are many regular practices all over India. For example, pickpocketing is a regular practice in all the bus stands in India. Do you say that it's founded on law? Is it a legal system? Or it's a very bad example, I know. You can take any other such regular practices. The regular practices don't warrant that there is a law or legal system behind it. We don't understand it simply because Indian culture is a different kind of culture, which is formed and which sustained in some other kind of mechanisms, not certainly this legal system. So comparing Manusmriti and all those things to law book is certainly a category mistake. You are just assigning one category, properties of one category to some altogether unconnected another category. So, but we see the practice. There are jatis and there's an untouchability, something like that. Why does it happen that we feel that we are experiencing it? And it requires research. I think that book, I think in the history of research on caste system, it's a milestone. Because last more than 20 years, I am also associated with Professor Bal Gangadhar. We had carried out some research on caste for more than 10 years, fieldwork, etc. We did not know what to do with this kind of, because this is the usual question we face everywhere. For last 10 or 20 years, for next 50 or 100 years also, we are sure we will face the same question as Sufia pointed out, in the seminars, new people come and go. And within 15 minutes, we cannot convince you because in 15 years, we don't know what we are doing and what is the level of research. So, but the problems are glaring. It is actually, it's a problem of research. So you are standing on the side of common sense, reading some textbook and trying to figure out certain practices as something else. And here you are addressing a scholars, group of scholars who have done research for 15 or 20 years and trying to formulate their questions and trying to formulate hypotheses. So here, we appreciate you, but with that, I want to tell you that just don't forget that you are addressing some researchers who are doing research here and who are countering your textbook stories. That would make very interesting because you come up with your arguments and tomorrow you also become a researcher and you falsify some of the conclusions. Just take up the atrocity, this presentation by Sufia, just try to falsify it in the methodology of research. You cannot counter a research argument with a common sense, this thing, impressionistic statements. So that has to be done, but with all appreciation. Today actually, what we call caste system, it is a cluster of concepts which makes sense to Western. I don't know whether it makes sense to Western, Martin has to say, but certainly it makes, because they are the ones who have developed research on it. And this cluster of concepts, Hinduism is the key concept because religion. And I remember Balu's often cited example that he says, he used to tell it in lectures, that everyone told that India has caste system before independence. And after independence, more than 1/4 of India is divided and it became Pakistan, Bangladesh and whatnot. But even now also people say caste system is in India. They don't say in Bangla and Pakistan. So if Indian subcontinent is actually ridden with this problem, once you divide it into Pakistan, the problem will not disappear, isn't it? And everyone says that Muslims also have a caste system, Christian, and they say that they have borrowed it from Hindus. The term Hindu becomes very important because today whatever India in geographical map we have called India, people think that this is the Hindu India. So caste system must be there. And here itself you can realize what sort of argument is it. Why don't you say that caste system is in Pakistan? If before 1947, if caste system was there in Bangladesh and Pakistan, according to your books, then one should say that today also there are, but it's not a problem. It's not a problem in international forums also. People don't talk about caste atrocities in Pakistan because it is Islamic country. A caste atrocity must be there in Hindu country because caste system is sustained by cluster of concepts like Hinduism and then priesthood, Brahmanical priesthood, that to Brahmanical priesthood. People of all jatis are doing that same craft and it is your experience. You go and see the world, but you say that Brahmanical priesthood. And hierarchy, no one knows what is that sort of hierarchy. If you go to your village and see in what way they are ordered. There is Melu, Kilu, okay. But Melu, Kilu does not make a hierarchy. We should be a clear-cut division of Melu, Kilu. And exploitation, and race, and endogamic practices like that. And then you come to ancient Indian evidence, Varna, Manusmriti, and then practice of untouchability, and like this. And we say that today the society has changed, but earlier it was different. This is another common expression. What does this earlier mean? Is it about during our grandfather's period, during Akbar's period, or Ashoka's period, Indus Valley period? I am a historian. The caste system, actually it was projected into Indian history. And use your common sense. the names you get in our Indian literature. I will not cite the Manusmriti and different type of lines because I have already given an example. You see Valmiki from Beda background or Vyasa from fishermen. And we have one of the Saptarshis has a wife of scheduled caste women. What is this? If caste system is so rigid, how these stories could get generated? Kalidasa was a Kuruba and he becomes the best Sanskrit scholar. How could Kuruba learn Sanskrit when this molten lead was put in the ear? See, these are the sort of questions you should ask. And questions are there around you. Once you start looking at this caste system story as a suspect, you prove it, it's a genuine, or you prove it, it is a false. But before that, once you consider it a suspect, then such stories and instances also will start emerging in front of you. How to explain it? You cannot just throw them away. One has to explain it through research. So we have lot of research challenges here, and that itself shows the potentiality of this argument, because this particular argument is generating lot of research questions, not simply impressionistic common sense arguments. So in that way, I feel that this is a milestone in the history of caste research. Thank you all.
I'm somewhat the odd man because after going to the book which I received, I realized that it was splendidly written book. A book which was trying to project a scheme which I know was initiated by, inspired by, or possibly monitored by Balakam. I don't have the freedom to refer to him as Balu, as it, as my friend does. But then I have an occasion to read what. Yeah. Although I wouldn't say that, look here, I'm into the bandwagon of Balu. I am just or I must use the past tense. I used to be just a teacher. A simple, I would say, boorish history teacher, possibly producing equally boorish history students. But then one thing which struck me after going through this book is it's a call for inquiry. It's a serious call for inquiry. And history is inquiry. So I must, I think, amend my self-assessment as not so odd after all. That book, I wouldn't make a mention of the individuals here. I think the book projects the ideas of more than who figure here on this platform. What it tells you again and again, is that what we think are our thoughts are in fact are not our thoughts at all. We carry somebody's flag. We carry somebody's ideas and move around and say that, look, this is what our ideas are. I think caste system, the world system, it's a very seductive word, extremely seductive word. Caste is, I don't know whether it's a hated word or a seductive word. I'm not sure as yet. Because all of us know that caste system, if it exists, is bad. It means that caste discrimination is bad. Whether you have a system in this country, a caste system in this country, as it has been raised, this question has been raised in the very introduction of this book, and it has been stated categorically that there isn't anything like a system, caste system. I agree. I know we have castes and castes. Castes proliferate. But then there is no system. I think we have a wonderful caste non-system. Because ultimately what you get is what you are indoctrinated with. I think we do not know that we are willing victims of indoctrination. We don't know. And that is why we are very happy being a part of that. All of us have been trained to believe that you should hate certain castes. We have been trained. Some time back, I was reading a wonderful author. I just love him, A.C. Grayling. There, he talks about racialism, racial hatred in the European context, of course. And there, he says, look, the Germans were told that Jews were contemptible people. Now, who are the Jews? We have a category called the Jews, yes, but then you hate that category called the Jews, but individually, X is a wonderful scholar, he is wonderful, he is a fine poet, yes, he is. You applaud the individual values or the values of the individuals, but then you hate the abstract. This is happening in this country. For example, if, it's very fashionable to hate a Brahmin. It's a sign of being a very progressive person. If you are a progressive writer, you should either speak against, not exactly Brahmins, but against the Brahmanism. I agree there, but then, you have a whole lot of things being said about a category called Brahmins, but individually he is wonderful, he is a friend. Individually we have so many friends. But then you keep hating the Brahmins. then you say, look, you are not hating the Brahmin, but you are hating Brahmanism. Now, this is happening about every caste. And one of the problems that we have about the inquiry into the caste, the first thing that has been done in this book is that it has subverted the idea. I think there needs to be a subversion of every idea in order to open the possibilities of that idea. It's a creative subversion. I'm using the word subversion in a good way. The postmodernists use the word deconstruction. A lot of times you don't construct anything, but you deconstruct everything. It's always possible. But then I believe that any received notion has to be interrogated. Because unless you do that, you will continue with this old flag which belongs to somebody else. And that is a very, very important call which this book makes. I'm not a student of sociology. I'm a student of history, and in the process of studying history and in an attempt to understand history, I haven't understood history as yet, I can assure you. I can assure you I haven't understood history as yet. I'm trying to understand it every day, today, even after 10 years of my retirement. But then, one of the problems of studying caste in India is that what it could have been, say, 3,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago is not necessarily what is today. Not necessarily, because I am referring to not the castes, but the caste consciousness. Caste consciousness is something which is created, manufactured, whipped up, or conjured up from time to time for various reasons, for various gains. It happens. I can tell you something. Look at our society. Normally, I don't know whether society can exist normally without tension. It has its tension. The difference between one caste and another, doesn't really matter. At least it doesn't really matter these days. Let there be an announcement from in the newspaper that the government is recruiting, let us say, 5,000 posts, 5,000 positions. Or for that matter, in a university. Of course, universities have forgotten the habit of recruiting people. But then, let there be an advertisement. Suddenly the applicants become more important, more conscious of their caste. In fact, they would rather forget their name than their caste. This is the reality. So, you have such contingencies. These are the election months for us, the months preceding the elections. If you read the newspapers carefully, there is no political prose which is not suffused with intense caste affiliations, caste hatred, pitting one against the other, which all happens. Normally, it is not. So, which is the reality? Now, the problem with us is, when we want to go to history and find out what was caste like, say, 2,000 years ago or 3,000 years ago. What was it at the time of the Buddha? What was it at the time of the reform movements, well, Bhakti movement and so on? A lot of times we are not able to find the right answer. We have confusing signals. We have confusing, in fact, that has been very beautifully brought out in this book. We have confusing signals. But what happens is, we tend to telescope the present to the past. I have always had this problem in understanding history. I know that is the problem. That is something which I always wanted to resist, but it doesn't always happen. We do not go to history for what we find there. We go to history to discover something which we want to discover there. That is precisely what happens. Historians are extremely slippery customers. They don't quite want to see what happened in the past. They would rather wish what had happened in the past. A lot of our history is wish fulfillment. I can assure you, a lot of our history is wish fulfillment. Now what do? There's no point in keeping on condemning the historians, which of course we do by not reading history. If you do that, I think mind will be uncluttered in a way. I would say go to history, but go to history with this thought that quite possibly you have been conditioned before to go to history with the certain thoughts which don't quite belong to you. So that is an interesting sentence in the book. I went through this book and then that is something which I always believe in. There are more questions in the book than answers. That is what a good book should be. If you give answers, there are history books which don't give answers, they give verdicts. Right? If, for example, if a history book gives answers, a final answer, the last word is said about caste. No. If that happens, historians and sociologists will be thrown out of job. They will have nothing else to do, than, because final word had been said. Final word in anything has not been said. It will not be said. That is the reality. There are always more questions than answers. When some answers are suggested nervously, gingerly, fine. One answer there will perhaps throw up half a dozen more questions. That is the reality. That is why I have liked this book. I went through this book for the last 2 days, because I got it only about a few days back, and I had some other things to do. I enjoyed it. Although personally, I would prefer to have the book in my hand and read it. That is, I'm an old-timer, sir. I'm an old-timer, a back number in a way, because I like the smell of a book. That's the way it is. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Okay, this is an extraordinarily crucial session for various reasons. Some of them my panelists have already pointed out, it has begun to raise a large number of questions which need to be addressed. And then a certain kind of address of these questions has been done in the book. That's the second aspect. The third aspect of the book itself throws up the challenge. Professor Surendra Rao has already wonderfully summarized the book and then talked about the kind of flavor and also taste that the book gives. The book also points out there is something else. It says that we have tried to identify a certain kind of problem and we tried to deal with this problem, but there are ways, there are a large number of questions, as Professor Rao was pointing out. We need to try and then understand and then find an alternative way of dealing with this problem. That's what the book concludes with. In fact, each of the 6 papers, 5 papers at least, not so much Balu's, but each of the 6 papers, because Balu's it's there in a certain way. Each of the papers actually says that we need to find viable alternatives to the issue that we are dealing with. So the questions that came up, in fact, open up a way into the book. The questions that came up, the questions that were not asked, probably they're all lurking out there. These questions are based on what is called some kind of common sense, some kind of learning, some kind of education that is available to us through social media or media and textbooks. The book takes up precisely this kind of learning, the sedimented learning imparted to students over generations, institutionalized in the universities through the discourses, through the subjects of study. Whether you study social sciences or humanities, these kind of understandings, a certain kind of commons, they have kind of permeated to the level of common sense. This is what the book tries to examine, and then examine them by exploring the assumptions on which these commonsensical understanding is based. Okay, what I have actually several points, and I thought that this will be a feedback to the writers, because whoever does the research does it in isolation. You sit in the room and then you start working, and when you publish something, it goes into thin air. Nobody knows. Not many people would get back to you. Some hostile reviews, if you are lucky, you will get them. Even otherwise, you don't even get even those things. So nobody reads the book. When you do a PhD thesis, it'll gather dust in the library. Okay, nobody reads it. That's the assumption with which we work. Not that we are cynical. You do research because you clarify certain things for yourself. In order to find out how I'm going, is it correct? The questions that bubble up in you, you're trying to find answers to these questions. That's why you undertake a kind of research. Okay? So I'd like to, without taking more time by just talking extempore, I'd like to focus on the points that I have actually jotted down. This collection, called Western Foundation of the Caste System, demonstrates 2 points. One is the rupture between explanatory accounts, the explanations that we give to a certain kind of phenomenon, certain kind of experience. A rupture between explanatory accounts and what such accounts are expected to explain. Okay, that's on the one hand. And the second is that it shows the grave consequences when a certain kind of explanation gets institutionalized, when a certain kind of explanation about a phenomenon is seen as the most viable one, and if it begins to be imparted to generation after generation, what are the consequences of that? These are the 2 issues that the book takes up. And here I think this needs a lot more clarity, though I think the members yesterday and today, we have been trying to point out this, but when we use the word caste system, the emphasis should be laid entirely on system. What does the system mean? A system is an explanatory account which aims at abstracting a unifying feature from a variety of discrete factors to explain a phenomenon. There are multiple things happen. For instance, in the morning in the room, many people were saying, my experience is this, somebody else's experience is this, somebody else's experience is, I have seen it, I have seen that. So there is a variety of kind of experiential accounts that come to us. When you have such variety, is there a commonality? How to grasp them? You can't counter one experience, one personal experience with another one and tend to think that, okay, this is the answer. Somebody else will get up and say that I don't agree with that one because my opinion is different, my experience is different. So if you have a billion experiences, then you don't have a way of understanding these experiences. Everybody has every right to maintain one's own experience. In such a system, in such a scenario, an explanatory system claims to provide a coherent account, an account which overcomes all the internal contradictions, internal variations of the phenomenon. That's what the system tries to do. So an explanatory system aims at abstracting a unified feature from a variety of discrete factors to explain a phenomenon. An explanatory system seeks to determine the cohering principles. It has to identify the principles. If 10 experiences are given, what is common to all these things? Can we find out what actually makes these particular kind of experiences to come forth? So those are called principles that are based on which certain kind of experiences are based. So a system tries to identify these underlying principles and then treat them as coherent principles. The allegedly chaotic phenomenon in question here we are talking about is jatis, and the explanatory account that is advanced by the West and from the West is called the caste system. What is called the caste system is such an explanatory account, a systematic explanation about this radically heterogeneous phenomenon called caste or jatis. Okay, it claims to give a coherent explanation. That's what the book is highlighting. It thematizes this problem. The book tests these claims of explanatory system, the ability of this system to explain the phenomenon. Can this system that the West has given us in the last 300 years, can it explain the phenomenon called jati which we experience every day in our everyday life? Does it explain at all? And what the book does is that it exposes a scandal of the system of explanation. It shows how scandalous this systematic explanation is by exposing this one. For none of the factors, what the category called caste system tries to do is to identify certain specific kind of features from this variety of experiences called jati experiences. From that it identifies 4 major principles, at least. There are many. These are what is called endogamy, what is called purity and pollution, hierarchy and violence. These are the crucial principles on which caste system can be built. This is the assumption on which European accounts are provided as an explanatory system about jatis. This is what the book tries to point out very clearly through an extraordinary amount of research, meticulous research that these people have focused attention on these categories. For example, endogamy, and then you will begin to see stunningly when you look at the genealogy of this term called endogamy, or this genealogy of a principle called pollution and purity, or genealogy of something called hierarchy, you will begin to see in their accounts, historical accounts, documentary evidence is provided, you will begin to see that each of these terms has validity, salience, and a kind of essence in European culture, in European understanding about European culture. This is what they try to expose from their research. For none of these can be consistently maintained. The Indian phenomenon that they're trying to explain by means of these principles on the basis of which a system is built, that system is incapable of explaining variety of phenomenon, because if you see something called here, you don't see it there. It doesn't work at the other end. It doesn't, the purity and pollution doesn't work across vertically and horizontally. So how can this system be said to explain the phenomenon which is supposed to do? That's the question that they're raising. The book goes on to demonstrate the classic, Professor Rao has already negatively talked about deconstructive phenomenon, but it seems to me it's a classic case of deconstruction. I know my friends also won't like, Balu doesn't like the term, but still I would like to stick my neck out and then say that what they perform, in fact it can be demonstrated, what they perform is actually a brilliant deconstructive analysis. What this demon called deconstruction does, many people don't talk about it without knowing it. What the demon does is that the assumptions on the basis of which certain kind of truth claims are made, these assumptions they get unraveled. That's the classic deconstructive method. Suppose there are certain assumptions on which you make certain truth claim that this is true on the basis of this, then the deconstructive job is to show how these assumptions are questionable. You unravel the assumptions. And precisely that's what they are doing with regard to something called the caste system. Okay? And they do it with vigor and vibrancy in the book. The book is extremely readable. It unravels the ground assumptions that determine the alleged features or properties that I referred to earlier, and the collective reveals the figment of what is called, can be called emperor's cloths of the system by showing that each of the features is essentially rooted in Christian experience of the world. This collection is not an exercise in historical analysis. These are not historians, though they undertake a lot of historical work, studying from the biblical knowledge and studying actually Portuguese and Spanish histories. They examine that. Martin has done that, and Jacob, who's a contributor, who has done the other kind of work. The most significant and daring achievement today of the book is the showing the disastrous consequences that result from the institutionalization of these explanatory accounts. What we have done, and that's what is coming out in the questions that were being raised. And those questions that we have not raised, we have not articulated, but they are there lurking in us and disturbing us. what is behind, what is the basis of these questions is something that the book tries to tell us. And if you institutionalize, which we have already done in the last 200 years, through creation of educational textbooks, educational discourses, and the disciplines and the institutions. Every university has these disciplines, and each of these disciplines internalizes this discourse based on what is called caste system, a systematic explanation about the phenomenon, heterogeneous phenomenon called jatis, okay, jati experience. That's what the book tries to expose. And then it points out what are the disastrous consequences of these explanatory accounts that founded on, these are disastrous because these are based on alien ways of thinking that are inimical to and alien to Indian modes and Indian forms of thinking. Not one, but Indian forms of thinking. The entire discourse of caste, from historical to hysterical, self-righteously roots itself in the explanatory system cherished in the Christian theological understanding of the world. It is such a discourse which permeates the legislative. That's what Prakash's brilliant analysis of British legal system, he tries to expose that. When such kind of system gets institutionalized, it will have consequences for judicial, legislative, juridical, or rather academic, activist, political, and educational domains. It will have serious consequences which we are witnessing in our universities, in our social life every day. Civic relations also get disturbed. Curiously, as you know, and Prakash was pointing it out yesterday, which is a fascinating kind of scenario. For hundreds of years, jatis have moved across the borders, and they went to various countries. But in those countries, jatis have had a certain kind of muted existence, as it were. But if you see the stridency and the shrillness with which the rhetoric of caste system, that explanatory system, invaded the globe in less than 2 decades. How old is the discourse of caste system which consolidated itself? It's less than 2 decades really. Though it has a genealogy, it has a background in missionary writings and then administrative writings, anthropological writings, and a whole range of other things. But it has gained a certain kind of stridency. In the last 2 decades, they have consecrated the caste system, the idea of caste system, into a lingua franca today to talk about the jati phenomenon. The book warns us of the dangers of globalizing virulence of this language. It warns us, it tells us what the dangers of this kind of language are. The language and its telos lead to the considerable consolidation of identitarian unities and genocidal potents. This would be catastrophic in a culture which lived for millennia, nurture differential kind of existences and cultural formations with shared kind of, in a shared habitat. Against this background, the book throws up a challenge. How do we think about an alternative? If something called a caste system, an explanatory model got institutionalized and it has disastrous consequences, what are the ways we can find alternative? This is the major challenge which the book opens up and then asks us. The work of the collective is unprecedented and path-breaking. One can no longer hope to deal with something called the caste question without engaging with the challenge that this work poses. Simply a cynical or self-righteous dismissal or self-interested dismissals of this work will not do. Nobody can say, these people say like that, they're academics, they sit behind the doors and they write this kind of thing. That's not going to be helpful. It is right there in front of us. It can only aggravate the viral malaise called the caste system. How to affirm the challenge and respond to it remains a major issue for all those of us who are concerned with the jati phenomenon. The collective sets out two double tasks: to unravel the assumptions of the foundation of the system and the anomalies that betray, the anomalies that confront the system that it purports to explain. Number one. Number two, the need to develop alternative hypotheses to build another system. This is where, again, opening up this one, this is an aspect that needs to be brought out to the collective, and then I'm interested in actually engaging with them and then pushing it further and see where we go with this kind of thing. How do we find an alternative is a major challenge. Okay, the book challenges the assumptions and demonstrates very concretely what are the consequences of this and how this system has been built, but it also seeks an alternative. Okay, while the collective's achievements with regard to the first task, that is unraveling the assumptions, first tasks are pioneering and substantial, it appears to show more of a concerned gesture with regard to the second task, which is finding alternatives. The collective is not unaware of this, and from the passing allusions, one can see the possibility of these scholars coming together to strive and forge, they would strive and forge an alternative system of explanation in the near future. While moving with the collective to take up the double task, one might want to focus a little more closely on the methods, if we can call that, that is advanced in the, to think about the alternative. The way they try to think about an alternative itself requires an attention. If you begin to focus on that, you'll begin to see something interesting emerging as a challenge to us. The method in question here is tested hypothesis. Any hypothesis you generate, that needs to get tested. That's the method. Okay? Tested hypothesis alone can build theories. This is the basic way in which that can be done. And the premise of this hypothesis is that the efficacy of a theory, the efficacy of a system, the capacity of a system can be, of a theorem, the efficacy of theory is in its capacity to explain the large number of different kind of phenomena. The theory must be in a position to explain. These are the premises, and that's the method. Further, better theories supplant weak theories that are betrayed by anomalies. A good theory needs to replace a bad theory. The existing theory of explanation about caste system is a bad theory because it is based on certain kind of assumptions which are peculiar to a particular culture. They cannot explain divergent phenomenon. That's why it needs to be replaced with a good theory, another explanatory system. That's the position that the authors seem to take. The premise of the collective is that the theory of the caste system is rooted in Christian theological assumptions or hypotheses which are deeply culture specific. Hence, the theory's failure to explain what is heterogeneous to the grounding assumptions of this particular explanatory account. Hence, the emphasis on building alternative hypotheses and theories. Here one wishes to pause and ponder. This is where I kind of stopped and then started thinking along with them. Is theory or system building a universal urge? Does every culture build a theory? Does every culture want to build a theory? Does every culture want to build an explanatory system? We don't have in the last 3,000 years an explanatory system about jati. Jati phenomenon is there, but there's no system. Why? So the question is that, is theory building a universal urge? Should cultural reflections be sublimated and justified only through the mechanism of theorization? Are these the only ways in which, is theorization the only way through which explanations can be given? Can we cite such endeavors in the extended cultural traditions of India? Is it possible to look historically? If theory building is the root model of European configuration of learning, this is major hypothesis from Balu, the root model of learning that is peculiar to Europe is theorization. And if our efforts, even when they are necessary and positive, our efforts are aimed at displacing bad theory with better theory, aren't we reinforcing theorization as the most covetable and superior model of explanation? Wouldn't that imply according a hierarchy to the configurations of learning? Two kinds of configurations of learning, theoretical, practical. If we say the theoretical is something that is more important, aren't we subscribing to the hierarchy, is the question. What would be the implications of such endorsements in cultures whose root model of configuration of learning is said to be practical or performative? Again, Balu's hypothesis. Is theory building or systematization the ultimate destination of reflective explanations? All reflections, should they lead themselves towards theorization? Why is it Indian reflective creative traditions never seem to have valorized such a destination? As we ponder these questions, we also notice that the admirable productivity of the model, in fact, reveals its possible limits as well. In fact, when you look at the book, one of the stunning achievements of the book is when it looks at and analyzes European works, it's the most successful one. It begins to unravel the European assumptions by means of European data, and then it's it's wonderful and probably first of its kind. Okay, that you will see. The model of theorization is most effective when it confronts another theory of explanation. Because these are theoretically based, looking for alternative theories, they can challenge an existing theory. They are most successful there. And then admirable. Here that the collective excels in its original contribution. However, the axiom of this method appears to be that theory alone can substitute theory. Theory cannot provide here the point I am trying to make is that theory cannot, or can theory provide an alternative to theory, is the question. On the contrary, it would only constrain one to generate another theory, albeit an alternative within the circle of theorization. Such theoretical turn can be quite productive within the circle of theorization itself. Can theory become an alternative to theory? That's the question that I'm basically raising. Whereas when it faces something which is coherent but deeply unstructured, like Jati phenomenon, explainable but not systematic. The theorizing drive is required to see its limits. The heterogeneous phenomena of Jatis expose the system builders of Europe to such a limit. Europe can face that, but it was not able to respond to that. Normally, and I'm quoting here Balu, normally research is supposed to, research renders questions sharper. Research enables us to pose our questions in a sharper way. But in the case of caste, these questions become vaguer. We do not know what kind of questions we should be asking. The more I read, this is from Balu, thousands of books, the more confusing it becomes. But when Europe faced this kind of problem, the mind-boggling and disturbing, maddening kind of variety of practices and then, compositions, Europe faced a confusion. But disregarding the centrifugal force of such phenomena, European theological system of explanation imposed itself on the proliferative ensemble of Jatis and ignored the anomalies. Deliberately they ignored. Today that's something that we are continuing to do. European theological system of explanation imposed itself. In this context, it must be noted that Jati is just one and not a particularly privileged one either, reflective and livable nodes among many others in the Indian tradition. Jati is just one notion, one node among multiple other nodes. Each of these nodes, I'm suggesting, each of these nodes is going to throw up a major challenge for any kind of theorization. What are these other nodes, other notions? Dharma, karma, adhyatma, itihasa, jnana, para, vidya, loka, deha, manas. All these terms permeate our everyday languages. Those of us who speak Indian languages, these terms are common to our languages. But these challenge really any attempt to provide a systematic theoretical explanation. And Jati is just one among them, not a privileged one. Duncan has done a wonderful work. His PhD thesis actually shows and demonstrates very clearly the way Jati has been used in Vachanas and then why it does not become, it becomes an obstacle for a certain kind of Adhyatmic inquiry. That's what he demonstrates in his work. Okay, so each of these terms is going to throw up a challenge, and Jati happens to be just one, which weave the expansive network of reflexive praxial traditions of India. They show the limits of European explanatory systems, composed of concepts like justice, European categories, justice, agency, law, politics, spirit, knowledge, episteme, the other, history, world, nature, you name the term, which are also part of our discursive system. The subjects that we study, they are based on these concepts. As we struggle to find alternatives to this disruptive system, which has been imposed on us, disruptive system, we may need to collectively and individually also to ponder, should cultural difference be configured only through the root model of theorization? This is a question. As we try to open up and then move further to find alternatives, I wish to think along with them collectively and also individually, what are the real alternatives to this model that Europe has clamped or rather implanted in every country. Thank you.
Thanks to all the panelists for a wonderful contribution. We have overshot the time, so we will not take the questions from the floor now. But if Prakasha permits, when we come back, we will take steal half an hour from his session and gather here for the questions from the floor. I'll just say one line before we conclude, before I give over to her, that if there are any more positive comments to make about the book, please send it to Balagangadhara. I'll give you his email ID, because all the good things belong to him, his research. If there are any criticisms, comments, negative comments to make, send it to me. So I'll give you my email ID. Thank you. We wanted to take questions from the floor, and there was no time earlier, as you remember. So now we will open the discussion straight to the floor. If there are any questions to any of the panelists or a general question, please raise it. One request though, don't make it too elaborate. We are already cutting into the time of the next session. So make it brief and make it a question.
Good afternoon, everyone. Sir, first of all, I would not be able to frame a question with a question mark at the end straight away. These are my reflections after attending the session since yesterday afternoon. Yesterday afternoon, I was given information, as Duncan sir said, we would try to untie the knots, and after all these sessions, I have felt there are only knots in my head. I feel myself like an insect which is trapped inside a spider web. And a lot of thoughts are coming to my mind. The first thing which I want to ask is to Sophia ma'am. Ma'am, you just portrayed our statistics over there of National Crime Records Bureau, wherein you said the SC atrocities are 0.53% and non-SC is 1.19%. But you couldn't specify what is this non-SC. So I sometimes feel that all of us are trying to play safe. You're trying to be very safe and just trying to put out certain theories, but there is no action. Why there is a fear in everyone's mind as to come out with certain action, come out with something which is very strong. You're trying to hide something from us. I feel so. You're trying to play a blame game, trying to say that, okay, this is the reason. Then we say, no, that's not the reason. We try to find some other reason, and then the session goes on like that. So I would like to have an answer for this question.
I'm glad that you put it bluntly, right? That's important. Your description is also very apt. You feel like an insect that is trapped in a spider's web. But let me put it to you that whether you take the dominant story of the caste system or you take us who are trying to break it down, you will feel the same way at this point. Because internationally, the way that the world is looking at India is shaped by this dominant story. And actually, as Indians, we don't know what that story is. And that's what I want to stress. Look, many stress the fact that we are objecting to the word system. There are castes, there is no system. What I want you to think about is this. Can you use the word caste in a way that makes sense? One kind of sense. Can you use it coherently? I'll give you a challenge. Since the late 19th century, even the British who came up with this word, well, they didn't come up with the word, but they used the word, and did the censuses, started the censuses, could not find the caste that they were looking for. That was the problem. They went out into the field to find what? Varnas. Because that was the classical story. All the texts had told them that Indian society is divided into 4 Varnas. When they started the census, they wanted to find those 4 Varnas. And you have frustrated administrators writing back saying, throw Manu into the dustbin, he's lying to you. I have the records, I can show you, I can read to you. He's lying to you because you can't find these 4 Varnas. What do you find? So some colonial administrators would use occupational groups. Okay? So in some places like the Orissa area, they used occupation. In Maharashtra, or what we call Maharashtra today, but the Bombay presidency, they said we have to use nationality because they found a group which was calling themselves Marathas. Till today, the Marathas are a group. There is something called the Maratha movement. Do you know how many jatis are involved? Plenty. Plenty. Do you know what the status of those jatis are on the so-called Varna system? So, what I'm pleading with you about, I know there are knots and knots and knots. That's why I said 10 years it took for me to start untangling the knots. In 10 minutes, I don't expect you to make miracles. All I want you to see is that with good intentions, if you don't start untying the knots, internationally there's a coherence. They understand, or they think they understand what they're talking about when they say caste system. In India, we replicate the words, we can't even find a reference to caste. What is caste? Is it jati? Is Jati and occupational groups? There are clusters that are occupational groups, there are clusters that are not occupational groups. There are clusters that are above Jati, there are clusters that within Jatis splinter across. And you know what Jati refers to? It's just category. Just category. So what sense are you going to make by talking about caste or caste system as if you understand it? So that's the first point. We don't understand it. And in the book, you are not going to get a full explanation of how the West understood caste system. That's for your first point. Your second point. I put down a statistic and I said, there are no caste atrocities, not a problem. That's not what I'm saying. Let me clarify. I said 16.6% of the population faces 0.53% of criminal incidents. Okay? I took 2011 as the year, Duncan and I, the article, and we took that as a sample year. It's also fairly representative because it's not either lower or higher than the average. It's about the average. If you take that as the average, 16.6% of the population, SC population, faces 0.53% of criminal incidents. Okay? Because now you have NCRB data that tells you crime against SC is this much. That means what? Do the basic mathematics, which is that if you remove 16.6% out of 100, you get 84.4, something like that, 83.4% of the population, right? 83.4% of the population faces how much of the crime? 100 minus 0.53, right? So 98 point something, okay? I'm not playing games. I also have problems identifying who is SC, but the government doesn't. The NCRB doesn't. It's very clear. So that's why it's SC and non-SC. Because the government statistic only gives me crime against SCs. If they gave me crime against Brahmins, against Kshatriyas, against whatever, I could tell you what is the comparison. I'm not hiding anything because I don't even have access to those statistics. Those statistics are not generated. The government doesn't see it as important to generate those statistics. Yet, this is the statistics that, whether it is international sources or it is academics in India, are using to reinforce, to talk about caste atrocities. The problem is, even if you use this statistic, the story doesn't make sense. The further statistic I gave you was 0.53% of the population, of criminal incidents for 16.6% of population. Per percent of population, that comes to 0.04% of crime. Whereas the rest of the population faces 1.19% of crime. 1% of non-SC faces 1.19% of crime. 1% of SC faces 0.04% of crime. So you know what you're doing? You're actually building the scenario where you can't have a story of caste atrocities at all if you use these statistics. But that's not what I'm calling for. Because there are historical incidences which you want to understand. Yeah? There is the Ranveer Sena. There have been Yadav and other clashes. There have been group clashes across several different states. I assume you want to understand them. But you can't do it with this route. Because it's not caste system that's helping you understand it. I'll tell you something else. About 64% of the population, of the so-called Hindu population, is OBC. 16.6% is SC. You know what caste violence is? You know what caste atrocities are? Any kind of crime generated against 16.6% of the population is caste atrocity, caste discrimination, etc., etc., etc. Even when it's from the 64% of the population. It's not from the Brahmins, not from the Kshatriyas, OBCs. You know how your EPW talks about caste crime and caste atrocities? Within the OBC, they assume that they have some way of knowing which caste is higher and which caste is lower within OBC. Even the government doesn't dare to make such a claim, but our academics do. And so they say, when it's these two caste groups, it must be caste violence because this caste group, which is also OBC, that caste group, which is also OBC, this caste group is higher. So if they had done this to this caste group, it's caste violence. There is nothing by way of evidence, no scale, nothing to show what is the caste hierarchy amongst these groups. So you want answers, you want to untie the knots. What we appeal to you is to think about the categories that you are using so easily because they are generating the knots.
You see, earlier in my presentation, I was talking about how there is this invisible presence of the notion of caste system. Whenever we are talking about caste violence, caste discrimination, etc., etc., is this invisible notion of the caste system also present in your law textbooks? Right? When they talk about, I don't know if your law textbooks will talk about reservations, or I'm sure they talk about caste atrocities, etc., etc. My secondary question would be, how many legal scholars in India, if there are any, and you can say for the sake of argument, the generality of scholars, how many of them have ever questioned the necessity of laws on caste atrocities, right? And one reason why I'm asking you that is because, of course, you all know that there is this old protection of civil rights legislation, which was then layered upon by the 1989 legislation, yeah? The Prevention of Atrocities legislation. But what's interesting is that the Prevention of Atrocities legislation was extended massively in 2005, right? By an amendment. Now, you know what's remarkable? That amendment wasn't debated in Parliament. It's one of the most massive extensions to the laws on caste that I know of, right? Perhaps even more than the reservations and so on, which at least gets debated, or at least some buses are burnt, you know, when people are arguing for them. For this extension of the caste atrocities legislation, nobody seems to have debated it in your Parliament, at the national level, at the central level. How do you explain that? Particularly in a situation of the kind of context that Sophia ji and Duncan ji have said, that there are all kinds of omissions, occlusions, in even the statistical picture, to the extent that we don't know what the real story is being told by the statistical figures on caste violence. If anything, SCs and STs seem to suffer a disproportionately lower incidence of violence, right, or crime, let's say generally, if that's what they're recording. Ultimately, they're recording crime, not just caste-related crime. It seems a broader category than that. If that's the case, then what warrants an extension of the legislation on caste atrocities? And actually, you can even ask this question: what warrants the fact that your elected representatives choose not to debate such a massive extension of the law? Please have a look at the 2005 amendment if you think I'm wrong. Sorry, yeah, 2015. Yeah? If you think I'm incorrect about that, yeah? And just ascertain for yourself what I'm saying. You see, in any, of course I'm complaining about the lack of debate insofar as the extension of the caste law or the equality law to caste in the UK is concerned, right? But I'm not saying that absolutely there was no debate. Actually, the matter has been debated by both houses of parliament, right? And in fact, there have been disagreements. There was and actually the only reason the caste provision exists in the form that it does today is because political parties compromised on the caste issue for some other reason. They traded off the Indian community, if you like, yeah, and the future of the Indian community because of some other agreement that they wanted to make between the political parties. That's how. But before that, they were really debating this issue, right? How is it that in India, such a crucial matter as caste is not being debated? It's not a minority issue; it's everybody issue, as far as I can see. Right? Sorry, yeah.
I'll just add to something. You said reservations at least produce some kind of reaction. Prakashji also mentioned in the earlier session that India has been defending or trying to block the inclusion of caste in the Convention of anti-discrimination, anti-racial discrimination convention in the UN, UNCERD. You know how India does it? Take a look at the replies that we have been giving to the United Nations over the past 10 years or more, actually. Since the UN has been saying that caste should be included, India has said, no, race is not caste. That's about, I mean, there may be finer distinctions there, but that's not the main defense. Our main defense to the UN is that we have extensive affirmative action. We have extensive reservations, which we are broadening every year. Therefore, you should not include us, because we are doing everything that we need to do to fight this discrimination. Do you know what that means? You complain about the fact that reservations are eating up seats. It's not just a political game that local politicians play in order to gain favor from this community or that community. It's an international level game that India is playing. They think that they can tell the UN for 20 years on end, oh look, this year also we have extended our affirmative action, and that will put it at bay. It's not. There is no way that we are going to put this at bay simply by talking about our affirmative action. You know what we did in response to the US CIRF, Commission of International Religious Freedom, puts us on our watch list. You know what the government does as a response? They refuse to issue visas to the US CIRF representatives who are coming to India in 2016. I think it's good. At least the government took some stand. But this is not an answer. These people continue writing. It in fact deepens their conviction that India has something to hide. This is how they will report it to the rest of the world. And why? Because we have no answers. We know that at the ground level, we are nothing like Syria. But you don't have the answers how to prove that.
I'd like to just very briefly pick up the seriousness of the situation from the standpoint of European Union. For decades, European Union didn't care about caste at all. But what we see, Prakash wrote about it, but many things you can easily find on your own online. We see a growing number of documents, advisory policy strategies, etc., who are telling European Parliament, European politicians, that the problem in India is growing. So the answer that we have more reservations, what Europe says is, yeah, but it's completely inefficient, you have more problems. But then the consequences that are proposed, there is a document 2013, for example, that suggests to implement policies in terms not only already NGOs, but also on the legal level. It suggests to bring it as the major issue for EU-India summits. And you know what? One of the questions that is lingering in my mind since some years is why, for example, free trade agreement that was initially a huge enthusiastic initiative between European Union and India, why the hell it stopped? My assumption, of course, we should look at it seriously, but one of the assumptions that could be substantiated by other political development is precisely because caste is not addressed properly. And then please do look into the documents yourself. It's a very serious issue. There are suggestions that could lead, if you imagine what Europe does to some countries like above mentioned, that there will be some embargoes, some politicians would not be welcome, all kinds of problems could happen. Yes.
Sure, yes, I have some more news for you. It's not old news from 2015, it's quite new news. It's from 2017. In March 2017, you have in your, as a bill in Parliament now, an anti-discrimination bill. How many of you know about that? Nobody knows? You know you introduced it? You don't know? You know this great anti-colonialist writer called Shashi Tharoor? Yeah, he introduced a bill in Parliament in March 2017. So it has, I don't know how much prospects of success it will have, but go online. It's actually very important that you all go online and have a look at what it says, right? And don't, like the 2015 amendment to the caste atrocities legislation, don't ignore it, right? Have a look at it, write to your political representatives about it, and ask them what that bill is doing as a bill in Parliament, right? But don't do it before you read it. Read it carefully, right? Don't take my word for it. You don't have to, right? It's an anti-discrimination bill, and it's actually modeled on the Equality Act of the United Kingdom. The guy who drafted it for Shashi Tharoor is a fellow in Oxford University. He's an Indian guy, but he's a fellow, you know. So your laws are still being drafted in Oxford University, by the way. He's an expert on anti-discrimination law. I'm not trying to undermine his scholarship, but when I started reading his commentary on the UK legislation, you know what he's saying? He's saying that the UK legislation not only has to be supported, but that in the longer run, what we need to do is fight against jati-based marriages. Right? So this is like, let's say, you know, the normal domain of anti-discrimination law is employment, you know, access to education, you know, access to public services, that sort of thing. You know, when you in UK or US, it'll be also like access to ordinary services, like even in the private sphere, like when you go to a shop, you shouldn't be discriminated against, etc. But is there any anti-discrimination law in the world, except the one in Nepal? There is one in Nepal, actually, which prevents you from marrying somebody. Is there such a anti-discrimination law, right? But the guy who drafted your anti-discrimination bill actually wants that for you, right? It's not only that legislation covers caste. If you're a vegetarian and you insist on only serving vegetarian food, somebody can take you to court in future. If that law ever becomes law, if that bill ever passes Parliament, which it could, if you guys are not careful, it could pass. If you're a vegetarian, be ready to have court actions against you. Right? So it's going to be a war of all against all in India in future, right? Because I don't think an anti-discrimination law like the Equality Act will ever work in India here. Right? It's just open-ended. It's not closed like, you know, the list of jatis for reservations and so on. At least that's closed, right? Until the next argument and the next bus is being burnt. It's closed, right? So at least every year you can renew it or whatever by some political negotiation. Anti-discrimination bill, which may become law, it's open-ended. In the future, you can have an endless number of legal actions up and down the country. Right? Your courts won't have anything else to do except fight anti-discrimination cases. Right? And I can almost bet that Indians will abuse that legislation. They will use it for revenge against each other. They don't like what somebody said, sue them under the anti-discrimination bill. That's what's going to happen. Yeah? So just be very, very alert about where this baby of the caste system is going. It's going to hit you in the face so badly if you're not careful. It's not just the UN who's going to hit you. Your own legal system is going to hit you really badly. Okay, thank you.
I think we should hear more from you. Yeah, we are looking for more questions, if there are. Yeah, there's one hand here. There was one microphone somewhere behind. Asio.
A very good afternoon. My question is to Mr. Shah. Sir, you had mentioned about caste legislations in the UK. So I wanted to know, are there any instances which, like, what made the UK to bring about caste legislations?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry, I wasn't perhaps very clear in my talk yesterday, but there has been a sort of orchestrated campaign since about the mid-noughties, like the mid-2000s, right? Slowly to write reports and convince some parliamentarians of the necessity of this and so on. There's an alliance of groups which wants this, right? And many of them are, you know, they frame their names and so on around some Dalit identity and so on. But as I was trying to say yesterday, actually, they're a broad coalition mainly of church-based organizations, right? And these evangelical churches and so on. And so, for example, connecting to the issue of the UN, if you look at there was a report early 2016, I think, almost 2 years ago, written by the UN Special Rapporteur on Minorities. And if you read her report, it's on caste and inherited status, right? Discrimination. Most of it relies on the International Dalit Solidarity Network, which is an NGO based in Copenhagen and gets funding from a multiplicity of different church organizations, mainly, and some governments as well in Europe, right? So that, based on that report, a UN report is written. Just like Sufiaji was saying yesterday about how, based on that Pew organization's report, a UN report is written. And if you look at the footnotes of the Special Rapporteur's report, which is a report made to the United Nations Human Rights Council, right? So it is for the world's attention. An overwhelming number of footnotes and references are drawn from the International Dalit Solidarity Networks, right? Which is an NGO which sits in Copenhagen. It doesn't sit in India. Of course, they have some links with the Delhi people in here and so on. But they are the ones who are using the United Nations in order, actually indirectly, to pressure countries like India and Nepal and so on. You know, much in the way that Sufiaji already said, right? And to act as though, you know. So, sorry, it's a very long answer. So there are these lobby organizations which are a network of different entities, actually. Yeah? And you're never really clear who is pushing what button, right? And because there are a multiplicity of them, one does this, another one does this, so they adopt multi-track strategies. If one fails, use the other one. If that one fails, use the other one, you know? As I've been saying in the morning as well, you know, the legislation wasn't not implemented, let's start a fire and, start a case, right? So in some way, they managed to get the message through, right? And keep the pressure up. So in my view, there's no popular demand for this legislation. The UK is being used as a proxy to increase the pressure on India. Right? So once you can say that the UK has this law, as you can see, Sashi Tharoor's bill is doing exactly that. Right? He's saying, oh, well, look, caste is already included in the UK Equality Act, we can use that as a model, bring it into India. Right? Or you use the United Nations as a way of saying, what the UN has told the UK now is that we must implement the law. We must implement the legislation. So this is the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, which is one of the big human rights bodies. Now, if they are telling that to UK, what about India? Yeah? Because you've got Sashi Tharoor's bills just waiting to be debated. Right? The UN is going to tell you what laws to pass in future? Is that what they're going to do? Sorry, it sounds a bit convoluted. I hope it made sense. Yeah.
The question appears to be that it's taking two examples. One is that within India, something that comes under ST category, there's many what quote and unquote tribal people. There is no homogeneity with regard to their treatment under the constitutional provision. The same people, right, tribal groups, they move to another state, they are in a different state, they have a different status. They are not under SCs or STs. Okay? That's one kind of claim. Second claim is that when you talk about, but there is discrimination. When these people, Banjaras, who in the 13th century is said to have, they have moved to the West and Europe, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and they settled there. But there is discrimination against them, a point you were also trying to make earlier. The second issue is that how were these people treated? What is the kind of discrimination that you find? Now, with regard to the second example is that within the OBC category itself in India, there are variations and there is some kind of discrimination that takes place. Now, in the Western countries, is there anything similar to such kind of discrimination? The second question is a little difficult, but the first question with regard to the migration of gypsies to Europe, I think a point you made earlier in the morning.
I can say you something about gypsies. The question is when. Because what we see in Europe for many centuries, since the gypsies entered, is that the law that was predominantly ruled by Christian ideas and framework simply didn't take them seriously unless they converted. So they were somehow tolerated. Oh, I mean, yeah, but this is for medieval time until, let's say, 17th, 18th century, right? And gypsies suffered a lot. You know, I mean, there were even times, again, I'm talking about centuries back, when you could kill a gypsy and, well, you will not end up in front of the court. They, in some countries, didn't have a legal status that will allow you to do so. Okay, but that's just the very old past. Well, now when you come to the 19th century Europe, everybody, more or less in most countries, became a citizen with equal rights, and there was a rising movement to what equal rights means and spreading it. So, normatively, gypsies obtained the same rights as everybody else, right? Now, the problem that I think is cropping till today is that the majority societies in different European countries more or less would expect them to assimilate, to accept the ways of living, give them standard occupations. And some gypsies did, but quite some did not. Now I see a difference in the way that is a heritage of the split. The Cold War heritage is there, because Western countries dealt with it in a quite interesting way, more or less saying, okay, it's not legal solution, you know. They just said, okay, let gypsies still continue traveling around, you know, and then we can give them some space, and they always negotiate with local magistrates what to do, and you know, all kinds of things. So till today, you have nomads in some countries of Europe that are living, some of them are living quite cozy life because they were able to get to some occupations. Some are, well, poor, but it depends, really, it depends. Now the solution in the eastern part of Europe during the Cold War was different. Communists built an equal society in a very different sense. And when they realized that gypsies are still organized, similarly to jatis, you know, there were groups and there were councils. Some gypsy groups even elected what is called a gypsy king, who decided some internal conflicts and problems. And again, most of it was outside of official law. But for the communities themselves, it was a very, very important thing. So what communists tried to do is to crash the system completely. So after little negotiations in the 50s of the 20th century, they put some of the leaders either in the prison or isolated them from the rest of the community. And they tried to mix these groups together. You can imagine what happened, huh? Because they didn't want to live together. Some of them were used for centuries to do only certain jobs. Suddenly we should do something else. So the communist experiment, as some of our scholars are calling it, created more and more problems in gypsy communities. And we are now, in fact, harvesting very bitter fruits of that era, because 40 years of crushing the communities. They moved them around the country, they put them into special settlements, all kinds of experiments happened. It's a disaster. So many of the gypsies are lost. They lost their traditions, but they neither became fully Czech people, although most of them go to school, most of them have Czech education, etc., etc. But that situation is difficult. And there, of course, as far as I know, the discussion is about political solutions and social solutions. We are not passing special laws on that, that's outside of the legal discussion. So, to give you just basics.
The question probably deserves a general answer as well. The general answer is that if your question is, which is, it seems to me, ultimately, is there discrimination in the West? And if there is discrimination, how does the West deal with the discrimination question? That's the general level. And now, I think what the panel, the people who have written the book and then they have been arguing about it, many of us are also participating in it, is that surely everybody would agree that there is discrimination in the world. Nobody would deny that. But the point is that how do you configure this discrimination? What kind of attributes you lay to this idea of discrimination? That is exactly where I think we are inviting a kind of collective reflection on the question, as far as that question pertains to India. Because often discrimination is, kind of associated, linked, as if there are kind of genealogical linkage between discrimination and jati. That's where the problems come. And that's what they're trying to question constantly. And the book, and then their arguments have been trying to make it very clear. So discrimination is in the world, in India also, there's tremendous amount of discrimination, no question about that. But how do we understand this discrimination is the question. So the West has a different way of understanding, and then in the Indian case, the way it has been represented is the problem that we are trying to deal with. No, I think the path-breaking research that is going on at Martin's department, I think we must talk a little about that. That the study of Indian Christian organizations that you were referring to yesterday. You know that the difference between Indian Christianity and European Christianity. The point that
Okay, thanks for this question to say something. Well, people, basically, we are discovering with the PhD student, her name is Tess Jos. She's a Christian from Kochi, from very old, in fact, Christian traditional family, that you and your forefathers created a beautiful culture that turns even very intolerant dogmatic systems into another beautiful Indian tradition. Now, what I mean to say, because it might sound a bit strange, but what I mean to say is that through questioning, analyzing, and thinking how local Christians, both lay and priesthood and nuns in Kerala, understand the basics of Christian teaching, how they connect certain concepts together, how they understand the message of the Bible, what does it mean that Christ is the only way, for example, that is my favorite. We are finding out that these people are in fact filling it in with very Indian understanding that is completely different from what the biblical message has been for Christian thinking for the last 2000 years. So that's a fascinating research that is going on. If that is enough for the point, maybe I can give more details. But there is certainly a huge field in that sense, because we have ideas that the same holds for most of the Muslims in India. And it will explain why so many anthropologists and Indologists are struggling with multiple religious identities, because they go to some dargah, and then there is one ritual for both so-called Hindus and Muslims, and some people are even Jains, or even Buddhists, and all of them partake in the same thing. And then when you go to people, to the community that takes care of that particular dargah, this particular community, it's very difficult who they are. In the very same family, there is one Muslim who is doing the Muslim practices, and another two are doing more what we call Hindu practices. Then what? So there are all kinds of these instances, and our research tends to look at it from a different angle, but yeah.
There's an Islamic story about a similar kind of story with regard to India can be talked about. I'll give you a small example from the classroom. A few years ago, I was teaching a course, I think 2006. My class was composed of a large number of students from Yemen, and 2 students from Indonesia, 3 or 4 students from India. Some of them were Muslims, and there was and half a dozen from Central Asian countries. That's the kind of heterogeneous classroom. And the topic was, a student was making a presentation. This is about a Hakim, the doctor, local doctor, and she's a Muslim woman, stays on the university campus, a 4th class employee's wife, and she has this peculiar way of treating people. And she's a Muslim woman, and what she would do is that if you're suffering from some ailment, she would ask you to bring a bowl of oil, and then she will ask you to hold that, and then recite probably verses from Quran, and then breathe into the oil, and then breathe into your face, okay? And afterwards she would give her a piece of roti or something, recite some verses, this kind of practice that goes on. So this girl was presenting, the student was presenting this one in the classroom, and said that this is all something connected with an Islamic medical treatment or something, because the female was the doctor, so-called quote-unquote doctor, was a Muslim woman. And you wouldn't see that. We never expected that something was going on in the classroom. The class, about some 15 students, half a dozen of these Yemen students got up and became very emotional, almost violent, and said that this is not Islam, this is shaitan. They declared it in the classroom. And then the students from Central Asia gave a very different response. Why are you finding fault with it? In fact, in our place, this student was from Kyrgyzstan, I think. She said that we go to a tree, we tie a thread around the tree, we go around that, and then we sit in front of the tree, and then we recite Quran or whatever, okay? So there are many, and then the Indonesian students came up and said that, well, we take stories from the Ramayana and Mahabharata and then mix them and then perform them. So there's an incredible difference, but it was impossible for the students from Yemen to consider what these people were treating as Islam. So what's happened to Islam and Christianity, wherever they traveled, the local cultures, if they are strong, these were assimilated into the local cultures, and then they colored them. If these various cultures are coloring whatever they have received as Islam and monotheistic traditions, you can think about this tenacity of Jati cultures. Jati cultures have simply assimilated. As a result, in what is called the Moharram songs of Telangana and Andhra, in many places, in Karnataka also, Moharram songs include actually the songs about local deities and also about Ali, okay, Prophet Muhammad's son-in-law. And then they treat Fatima. There's a whole song. There's a fakir who talks about Fatima and Sita. These are one and the same for him. Fatima and Sita. This goes on. There are incredible stories that are available. They come from the classrooms. If we begin to reflect on ourselves, if we scratch a little of ourselves and begin to see around, then we'll get all these kind of diversified kind of understanding and living, cohabiting with others. That is something that we can learn. What happens to monotheistic systems, what happens to Islam and Christianity in the Indian soil is an unexplored area. I know some of you may be familiar. Margankali is a song culture which has emerged from Kerala, which talks about Syrian Christian community. Okay, but that's a local cultural form that has emerged, which incorporates local gestures, local song cultures, and then a flourishingly new performative tradition has come into existence. These are incredible things. We need to learn about them.
Thank you to all the panelists. Thank you, Duncanji, for just giving me the floor to kind of just make some concluding remarks. I think I just want to, first of all, repeat my heartfelt thanks to your college and to the whole SDM Sanstha. And you've done, I mean, again, you've done incredible. Incredible degree of organization and efficiency, and just making us feel comfortable and at home. And I really sincerely felt thanks. And this kind of thing, when you come to England for this kind of things, we are never that hospitable. You probably know about the English cold-heartedness or something like that. But here you can really feel a different culture, and I feel it every time I come to India. But here it seems very particularly poignant. Secondly, I just want to say, I mean, as you've seen how the discussion has developed, I apologize if some parts of it were a little bit confusing or just very unfamiliar because they are talking about some EU arcane dimension of EU law or British law. But one of the things I want us to kind of as a takeaway, this American terminology, like takeaway from this conference, we can say is, first of all, the interconnectedness of the legal world, right? I mean, people have mentioned some things about globalization during the 2 days and so on, right? Whatever is happening in one location is going to come in to your system in some sense, right? So, of course, we have to know how to deal with this globalization issue also from a legal dimension, right? And I think our project in a way tries to key into the larger problem of globalization, but by focusing mainly on the problem of the caste system, right? But as you see, the problem of the caste system is not really divorced from the historical interaction between Europe and India. It's very much it's actually part of that story, which seems to be continuing despite decolonization 70 years ago or something like that, right? So, but it's taking much more intricate and diverse forms today, right? So we've mentioned the United Nations several times. We're mentioning these, NGO organizations either in Europe, somewhere in Copenhagen, or I don't know where the Pew organization happens to sit, right? So somewhere in the US, right? So there are these bodies which are sort of in a more subtle way influencing what happens internationally, and the ways in which India is having to respond to these currents, right? They are also influencing the United Nations level of global lawmaking, right? Now, global law is a big phrase now, right? If you come to any of these schools in law schools in European countries or even American law schools and so on, we are very big on global law, right? It's a real buzzword sort of thing, and in a way you can say it's the legal dimension of you know, globalization or even glocalization. You know, the connection of the global and the local, right? So the United Nations is playing a fundamental role in this, right? It's not becoming absent or less relevant. It's actually becoming much more relevant. And one of the things I noticed, and I think we'll probably continue to notice it as part of the research project, is the increasing prevalence of the United Nations, not just as a human rights law-making entity, but also as an entity which has increasing level of, an increasing pitch of concern with respect to caste issues. Right? So whenever Indian scholars are debating these issues among themselves and so on, it's all very good, but you need to also keep an eye on the global dimension. And what happens comparatively in jurisdictions like the United Kingdom or the EU as a block of something like 29 states today, or also the United States, because these countries and larger, if you like, political entities are still drivers in terms of setting the international agenda. Right? I mean, we might think that you know, the Indian delegation is going to Paris and saying some nice things about solar energy, and that's good, yeah. And it actually shows that India is playing an increasingly important role in international lawmaking enterprises, which is a very encouraging sign, and I welcome that, right? But don't forget that some of these, the old, if you like, powers, right, and the old power blocks are still trying to have their way with lots of other countries in the world. Right? And India, rather than being a victim of these kind of things, has to play a very, very active role. And that's why I think part of the project aim is to encourage the participation of Indian scholars as well, to increase our general awareness, right, as to how should not just like the British lawmakers and NGOs and so on respond, right, and the people that kind of people that I'm working with on the legislation in the United Kingdom, but more broadly how India should respond as a country, right, and how Indian scholars, NGOs, you know, students, law teachers, legal academics, researchers, and so on. What is your role in all this, you know? Are we going to be stuck, continue to be stuck with this age-old endowment, if you like, you know, first of all, of course, of the, you know, the interaction of India with Christianity, but also something which was deepened, right? That interaction was actually deepened because of the experience of colonialism, right? Which we can't divorce from the equation, right? It's not necessarily that colonialism generates the discourse on caste, but it definitely embeds it much more deeply into the consciousness of India and Indian culture, right? And so we have this very alien entity which seeks to explain what is happening in Indian culture. And we've seen in multiple ways over the last 2 days that actually it's failing to do that, right? It's just generating all kinds of dysfunctions and anomalies, and it just doesn't fit, yeah? So I think increasingly what we need to do is actually have a kind of much more Indian discourse, right? And develop a discourse which not just legal, but also, let's say, in sociology, in political science, whatever domain you're interested in, and to try to generate an originally Indian theorization, or Venkatji, all due respect, right? What you, I full respect to your your earlier remarks about theorization. Of course, that remains a sort of deeper problem for us to resolve, right? Whether or not we are going to tackle this at a theoretical level, or are we going to actually start to think about how this happens performatively, right? So that's actually a big lesson that I draw, particularly from Venkatji's remarks over the last 2 days. But there's no question that if you're going to respond to Western entities and entities like the United Nations, theory remains extremely important, because all their, if you like, propositions, ideas, and so on, are actually couched in theoretical form. Right? And so we're going to have to respond to that as well. So you're going to have to act at dual level. To communicate within an Indian cultural context, you might have to adopt performative methodologies, right? But to communicate with the rest of the world, and particularly the Euro-American world, and at the United Nations level, you must be aware that, you know, certain level of, again, to use Venkatji's words, and I accept it without much argument right now, this deconstruction, right, of how Westerners have actually put together theories about what Indian culture, traditions, and so on are about, right? Do we accept that, or do we have a genuine response to make to that,
right? So hopefully you can view this research project, you know, in that kind of context, right? It may not be the only way to contextualize it, but I hope it's one of the ways that provides some kind of relevance and meaning to this. And particularly the last session, you can see that I was trying to wind people up much more than I have been over the last 2 days, right? And that's deliberate, right? Because seriously, something has to happen from the Indian side, right? Otherwise, we're going to really be trapped with these kind of discourses. I don't see Western scholars solving your, notwithstanding that, you know, I work in the West, Martin is here. I don't see Western scholars really providing a serious response to this. Certainly not given the kind of circumstances that are prevailing within Western academia today. What I see, which is happening in India as well, is an increasing amount of identity politics and political correctness around that, right? And caste scholarship in Europe and North America is part and parcel of that. It's trapped within that, right? And they are encouraging Indians to pursue that path of a kind of war of all against all, which I would suggest is part of is going to be a consequence of a bill like Shashi Tharoor's bill, if we're not careful, right? So don't look to other people for answers. Generate your own, right? Think about what your own scholars are saying in a very serious way. Yeah? Don't ignore them, and please don't keep repeating these stories. Yeah? Try to think that there are other plausible ways of thinking about caste, right? Which exist outside of the trope of the caste system. So, okay, thank you very much. Dhanyavad for your attention.